guys, welcome back to my channel. My name's Hetty. If you are new, I post videos every single Sunday all about health, fitness, lifestyle and mindset and eating disorder recovery. So if this is your first time here, welcome. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. This is Tinkerbell as well, who's getting in the way of me film, so she's going to be in this video today too. So today's video, I thought I would talk about trigger foods. So trigger foods is a term that you may or may not be aware of, but it's generally known quite well within sort of the eating disorder community, and also sometimes even the diet industry will use those sort of terms as well. So what are trigger foods first of all, and also how to navigate around trigger foods and how trigger foods also can affect our lifestyle in general, maybe our goals, whether to lose weight or to end destructive habits around eating that we might have as well. So what is a trigger food first of all? And the term trigger foods generally refers to a certain type of food, whether it be specific or maybe quite general, like chocolate for example. This perception of a trigger food tends to come from people that have had maybe destructive relationships around food and these specific types of food. So for example, a person may believe that a certain type of food encourages them to act a certain way, in a destructive way, around that particular type of food. Let's say for example your trigger food may be chocolate because you believe that in the past and whenever you seem to be around chocolate, it creates a certain feeling. So maybe a feeling of anxiousness, maybe wanting to eat large amounts of it, maybe wanting to be quite secret around that type of food. So maybe trying to hide it from people, eating it very, very quickly to sort of get rid of the evidence of it. Like I said, eat it in secret, and also eating large amounts of it. Generally, when people describe how a trigger food tends to make them feel, it tends to make them feel quite uncomfortable. So let's say for example in the diet industry, a trigger food might be a certain type of food that people tend to feel quite anxious around because they believe that they will be out of control if they are left with that certain food. So the belief behind a trigger food is that almost like that particular food has power over them. Okay, so the belief that a certain food will cause you to overeat in a way that does not serve you, in a way that you don't feel, in a way that you don't want to eat it. So I'm sure you've all had that experience of eating something, maybe you ate a bit too much of something and you turn around and think, why did I do that? I did not want to do that. And you're left then feeling maybe guilty and maybe shameful as well. So that's sort of generally how I would describe a trigger food. The belief that a certain food has more power over you and that maybe you lack the willpower or discipline to sort of either eat it in moderation. So let's say for example, instead of having the whole pack of Oreo cookies, you only have one or a couple. That person would be quite moderate in how they approach that certain food, so that food wouldn't necessarily have power over them, that they feel that they feel compelled to eat more and more of them. Particularly with, I think, the binge eating and bulimia community, maybe also the anorexic community as well, but generally eating disorders, particularly the binge eating disorder and bulimia. I know when I was struggling with binge eating and bulimia, I tend to have certain foods that I felt really drawn to if they were around, but it also gave me this feeling of anxiousness and feeling like that food had more power over me than I could. So I couldn't just have one biscuit, it had to be the whole packet. I couldn't just have one spoonful of peanut butter, I had to eat and eat and eat and eat the whole jar. If you are a binge eater, I will link my video down below and I go into much more detail in the specifics of binge eating, and also I will link my other video down below and I sort of explain the differences between overeating and binge eating, because there is a huge difference. So I would encourage you to check that out. I will link it down below, but obviously for the purpose of this video I'm not going to go into the details of binge eating. So quite commonly, whether you are a binge eater, whether you struggle with binge eating, overeating, or just generally you are maybe on a diet and you're trying hard to stick to your diet, but you tend to keep falling off the bandwagon. Generally, the most common advice for these type of situations, so particularly within the diet industry, if you are on a diet and you're on a plan, or you're tracking your calories, whatever that might be, and you're aware of certain types of food that seems to have this compelling power over you. So let's use peanut butter, for example. So you believe that peanut butter is one of those foods that you just cannot eat in moderation. You have a spoonful and next thing you're eating the whole jar. So the typical sort of advice around this would be keep it out of sight, out of mind, don't buy it, don't have it in the house, which I think is useful to some extent, but also not so much. So particularly if you're going on a diet, usually that could work for a certain amount of time, but obviously once you come off that diet, what are you going to do? Are you happy to never buy that product ever again? If so, then there's probably not much of an issue. I suppose the first thing I would do is to address, is that a food that you're quite happy to completely keep out of your life? If you're not that bothered about having, peanut butter or ice cream or cookies, if you're happy to never invite those back into your life, then that's absolutely fine. And then that way you might be able to just break the habit by just, like I said, keep it out of sight, out of mind. I do believe to an extent when we've repeatedly binged over very high fat, high sugary foods and become very dependent on them, they obviously do have somewhat of an addictive substance to them. They are made to be addictive. Obviously, the more addictive they are, the more we tend to buy them. So I would say obviously keeping that in mind. And I'm also going to link down below my video on how to stop eating junk food. I will link that down below, but I would recommend watching that as well. But I'm also going to touch on another sort of perspective on this in particular within this video. If you're one of these people that are trying to stick to a plan and your trigger foods keep making you fall off the bandwagon and you tend to overeat on them and you're really struggling with that, I would personally ask yourself, are you happy to never have those foods in your life again? And like I said, if you are, then don't buy them, and then you're less likely going to binge on them that way. However, the only issue with this also is if you don't allow, say you love chocolate, for example, and you say to yourself, right, I'm never buying chocolate ever again and I'm happy to have that out of my life, you may start acting that same sort of way to another particular food. For example, ice cream. You may just then replace that bad habit that you had with chocolate over to ice cream as sort of an alternative. This is something that I actually did many years ago. I gave up chocolate for a year. I wouldn't touch anything that was chocolate related. What I found was, because I thought that chocolate was sort of my nemesis at the time. I was very young when I did this, mind you. So I believed that this chocolate had some kind of power over me, and that was the culprit. That was the reason that I couldn't get my weight under control or my binging under control. I gave it up for a solid year, but what I found was I was then turning to biscuits and cake, so things that didn't have any chocolate in them, but I would still overeat on those things as well, in which case it doesn't sort of balance it out anyway. So I would just say bear that in mind. If you are happy to give up a certain food forever, just beware that other foods might creep in and replace that food that you've given up. The next part that I'm going to talk about is something that I would suggest most people consider, particularly if you are an overeater, if you struggle with bulimia or binge eating, so any one of those, or you would consider yourself an emotional eater, so somebody that tends to have a specific type of habit where you tend to overeat maybe in secret, or certain periods of time where you're eating too much and you sort of come away and you're feeling a little bit disappointed in yourself. It seems to be a repeated habit that you have. So let's say, for example, you know, your peanut butter habit, you tend to overeat on peanut butter. This tends to be your trigger food. You may overeat on other foods, but peanut butter seems to be the one that has this, you know, strange power over you. The easy option and what is recommended, typical therapy, is get it out, don't bring it into the house, keep your triggers far out of you as possible, and that way you can sort of get on with your life. The only issue with this is it sort of opens up so much other opportunities to binge and to blame other things. So what started off maybe just being peanut butter as your trigger, you then start looking at, oh well, I binged the other day and I didn't binge on peanut butter, but I was alone in the house. So now being alone in the house is now your new trigger. Yes, it may not be a trigger food, but then, you know, you could look at what you binged on, maybe it was cookies or something like that, and you think, well, now that's a trigger food. Sooner or later, you start looking at every single aspect of your life being a trigger. And the only problem with this is it's almost like you're living a very, very sheltered life, because you look at everything as danger and you're very cautious about how to live your life, what to buy, and it really does make you live a very small life. For me, for example, I generally loved peanut butter and I wanted to still include that in my life, but if I was to look at it through that narrow lens and think, well, it's a trigger food, so I can't bring it into my life without it, or I can only have it when I'm around other people, how much of a small life does that create? It's not realistic, and it's definitely not how I wanted to live my life. What started off only being one small thing, you start looking at every single other aspect of your life, because that's not the only thing that is going to necessarily cause you to overeat. There's going to be so many other possibilities what causes you to either binge or overeat or emotionally, and sooner or later you're just completely cut off from your life, because you think, well, I can't be on my own, I can't have ice cream in the house, I can't have peanut butter in the house, I can't have chocolates, I can't go over to my mum's house when she cooks or bakes a cake, because I'm just going to binge, etc, etc, etc. Sooner or later you are living such a small life because you're trying to so hard to block off all of these external triggers actually aren't the main cause of your habit. That's going to bring me on to my next point now of how to sort of get around this and what to do with your trigger foods. Before I go into that, I think the main thing that I want to first explain, whether you are a person that binge eats, you are bulimic, or you are an overeater or an emotional eater, any one of those, it doesn't matter if you have an eating disorder or it just tends to be a habit that you have, go out to eat and you tend to overeat a little bit too much. They are all habits. They are literally just habits that we have created through repetition, basically. And how a habit is caused is basically we have a thought which leads into an action. So let's say the very first time you ever binged had a thought to, oh my god, you could eat the whole bag. So that's the thought that you suddenly had, whatever that thought was, which led to your action. So that's how you had your first binge. First had a thought about it, and then you followed it up with an action. So you did the action. So that in itself is just a circumstance. It's a one-off time. But the more and more we repeat this pattern, once we overeat the first time, we obviously get a hit of dopamine, which is a hormone that makes us feel good. We feel good anyway, particularly if we're eating very high fat, high sugar foods. This is all going to make us feel very, very good. So it's going to hit us with that dopamine hit within our brain. Then our brain then associates that particular action as something that's necessary for our survival because it makes us feel good. Our brain doesn't realize that we've just created this circumstance out of nowhere and it's not something that we want to do for the rest of our life. Brain just simply thinks, oh, it's made her feel good, I'm going to send her another signal to do that. So when she's not feeling so good, we're going to send that signal again. And it could be also related to that particular food, or we have that particular association with that food. So let's say the first binge you had was on peanut butter, and now whenever you see that jar of peanut butter, suddenly think, oh my god, my trigger food. That's the food that has this power over me. Again, we're creating more and more thought about it. We're looking at the jar of peanut butter. Nothing wrong with a jar of peanut butter. That jar of peanut butter is not talking to you. It's not screaming at you. You're creating an internal dialogue around that specific type of food. We are creating that feeling of anxiousness. So whenever we go about our life and, you know, we see our trigger food, we suddenly have all of these thoughts about it. So going back to, let's say, the first time you ever binged or you overate on something, because we now have that association with binge eating, either the action of binge eating or overeating on large amounts of food in a short period of time, whether it be binging or overeating. Over repetition of this action, so repeating it over and over and over again, then form the habit. So we now have created a habit around that particular action. Now it is now stored within our brain. So when it comes down to it then, when we're talking about ending a habit, there are two ways to sort of go about it. One is the out of sight, out of mind. Also, what it really comes down to is our thoughts, the thoughts we have about a certain behavior. These are what our thoughts are, what's creating our actions. Without our thoughts, there is no habit, okay? It's only our thoughts that are creating that habit in the first place. So we can either go about our life and avoid all of those triggers that we have, just living in fear, basically. Personally, it didn't work for me. It wasn't a way that I wanted to live my life. The real way to end a habit is to start observing our thoughts. So become the observer of those thoughts. Remember, part of our brain that controls our actions, the actions that cause you to go downstairs, open up the fridge, eating bars of chocolate, this part of the brain is very different to the other part of our brain which sends out those signals, sends out those thoughts, you should eat the whole bag. Whatever it is, all of those thoughts are coming from one part of the brain. The way that we move, the way that we actually act and behave is from another part of our brain. So we actually have full control over our actions. It's only when we don't recognize those urges coming from the lower part of our brain that's sending out those urges. We need to be the observer of those thoughts. Once we do that, we can then break the habit. We can actually change and rewire our brain so that over time, by not repeating on that same action, so not repeating on that habit that we're trying to break, we can actually break the habit completely by inaction. Remember, we've caused that habit by repeating on it. Once we do something repeatedly, it then becomes a habit. Think of a smoker. First time somebody smokes a cigarette, they probably really didn't like it. I tried a cigarette, I never went back to it because I thought, this is horrible. People have to repeat a certain action over and over again for it to become a habit. And that's exactly what you've done with food. You've just repeated a certain action and behavior over and over again, that it's now become a habit. Choosing a diet or weight loss plan isn't going to get rid of the habit. The habit's still going to be there. So that's the main thing I would say and emphasize on. It's a habit overall. Once we stop acting on the habit, that then becomes a habit. Action starts to become a habit, and those urges will start to die down because your brain recognizes that she doesn't need this action anymore. She doesn't need this behavior anymore. She doesn't need to overeat on food. She doesn't need to binge on food anymore because she's not acting on it. So I'm going to stop giving urges. So in terms of trigger foods, I would honestly say bring them in. If it feels too much at first and it feels a little bit overwhelming, try to first introduce them gradually. But really, practice is going to be the only way to get over this habit. If you try to avoid those foods, they're always going to have power over you. Whereas if you say, right, I'm going to introduce them head on and I'm going to bring them into my home and I'm going to attack this habit once and for all, you're going to get stronger at that. Whereas if you try to avoid those foods at all costs, they're still going to have that same power over you. And ultimately, you want to ask yourself, how do you want to live your life? Want to live your life fearing certain food? Or do you want to finally get rid of all of those fears, bring them in and have a normal relationship with them? Is how I recovered. That is how I got over certain trigger foods, certain fear foods, because I started to bring them in and broke the habit with those foods being into my life. Now I can have any type of food within the house and it doesn't have this compelling control over me. It's just it doesn't even come into my mind anymore because I've broken that habit within my brain. So, sorry, you can probably hear my dogs right now. Definitely encourage you to start small and start introducing those foods gradually within your life. Make a list of all the trigger foods that you feel are most scary and do one at a time. The more you're around those foods, the less they're going to have this compelling fear over you. So I'm going to leave that there, guys. I hope that's giving you something useful to think about. If you are really struggling with binge and emotional eating, I do have a completely free downloadable guide. I will link that down below. Literally, it's completely free and you can download it straight away. Also, follow me on Instagram. Please feel free to DM me as well if this is something that you regularly struggle with. Also, I have my own free private Facebook group, which I will also link below. So if you do want to get involved in that, I do regular videos and extra training on there. So if that's something else that you want to see, look at that and ask to join. It's a really good community. I'd be more than happy to help. Just remember, guys, that if I can recover from this, you can too. It's just a habit. You are not broken. So I really hope you enjoy this video, guys. Don't forget to give it a like and a subscribe. Hit the bell notification as well if you want to be notified when I next upload. I will see you in the next video. Bye.